So with that, my name is Donnie. I come from the very far away and medieval land of Dallas, Texas.
And I'm Daniel. I'm from the less medieval and closer, Northwest Georgia.
And we are the Appalachian Sword Demo Team. So what we do is called HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts. We fall under a group called the HEMA Alliance, which is a national governing body for these clubs. And what we do is we find old manuscripts on martial arts, we'll translate them, and we'll try to interpret the techniques from them. So what we're going to do for you today is we're going to talk a little bit about history, we're going to talk a little bit about sword techniques, and then we're going to demonstrate these sword techniques for you. So with that, 1350 to about 1450, northern Italy. Now this is after the bubonic plague, so we have a decrease in population, but what we get is a rise of artisan, rise of skilled labor, because of the lower population that they still need. And nowhere is this more highlighted than in the northern regions of Italy with the Mediterranean and these port cities. So you get Venice, Rome, Milan, Florence, all of these little city-states who all have a huge amount of wealth but a low amount of population. Now at this time, the northern region of Italy is part of the Holy Roman Empire. Just to their south in the middle region of Italy, we have the Papal States, which are run by the Pope and the papacy. And below that, we have the Kingdom of Sicily, a couple other rivaling things, which highlights there isn't an Italy at this time. These are a bunch of rival city-states fighting for resources, fighting and jockeying for power in their region. Now, what do you do when you have a lot of wealth and a low population, but you need to start some trouble? You hire Condottieri, contractors, mercenaries. So today we're going to talk a lot about the Condottieri. Now, how the Condottieri works was these cities, they would put an individual or a group representing these mercenary companies under contract to work. Now, depending on how the contract would go, your results may vary. For example, we have a couple historical documents of Condottieri meeting on the battlefield and very openly, tag out. Yeah, we're good.
You saw us fight. We fought.
We fought.
We fulfilled our obligations.
You guys can't say we didn't fight. And that would be enough to fulfill their contractual obligations. They would still get paid. So, as you can imagine, these contracts the Condottieri were put under was very legalistic, very explicit to try to avoid scenarios like that. Because the Condottieri, how do they make their money? They're going to live to fight for another contract. They care about living. They don't want to die. And that's going to be an overarching theme of everything going on for this show. So all these city-states, they would hire these mercenaries, they'd put them under contract for patrols, for war, whatever. And now, Italy was a really big hotbed, again, because of all this wealth, because of all of these small micro city-states fighting for power. So, around the middle of the 14th century, the 100 Years' War comes to a close. Now, at their time, they're probably calling the 100 Years' War the 50 Years' War, because it's after Cressy, before Agincourt. We're not quite at Henry V yet, the war isn't quite over, but they sure think it is at this time. So what happens when you have a bunch of English and French veterans of a war who suddenly no longer have a way to make money? Well, a lot of them stick around in the French countryside, burning and destroying every village they can, which causes a lot of problem for the French nobility, and the English nobility are like, what are you gonna do? Others of them migrate to northern Italy to become condottieri. One of our most famous condottieri that's documented was named John Hawkwood. John Hawkwood was an English veteran of the 100 Years' War, speculated to have served in the Battle of Cressy. We're not totally sure on that one. Everyone fights in the Battle of Cressy, obviously. So he would get contracted, and he serves numerous contracts. He has a lot of wealth and a lot of control over Italy. And at one point, he fights in the War of the Eight Saints. So this was a struggle when the papacy had moved to France. So the Italian papacy was less than happy with the Avignon papacy, the French papacy. And the Papal States, recognizing this division of power and their leading nobles moving to France as opposed to Rome, they start getting a little lefty. They start saying, hey, we're going to exercise a little bit more independence. Of course, the Pope, not wanting his subjects to be a little bit more independent, starts a war, starts trying to reign in these cities. Some battles happen, some massacres happen. John Hawkwood's under the service of the Pope. Now, towards about a year into the war, his contract's up. So what does he do? He goes to the Pope, and he says, Pope, my contract is up, and I'd love to continue fighting for you. Can I get a contract? Pope draws up a contract. So he goes to the other army, and he says, other army, I would love to not fight for the Pope. How much can you pay me for it? The Pope is only paying me this much. To which the other army says, we'll pay you that much. To which case, John Hawkwood goes back to the Pope and says, Pope, this is what the other army's offering to pay me. What can you do? They can't match it. All right, John Hawkwood, switch sides mid-war. Now, what's interesting about that is writers, depending on how you read it, they'll frame John Hawkwood as a person who was so horrified by the way the Pope conducted the war that he switched sides to defend the Italian people. But more likely, based on the historical documents that we had, he was just looking for the bigger paycheck. Condottieri were not really known for their loyalty. They were known for their contracts. Now, at one point during John Hawkwood's career, he was under contract by the Pope, and the Pope couldn't pay him. So what does he do? He's like, all right, I'm going to go to Rome. I'm going to go talk to the Pope. I'm going to try to square this away. So he brings his army of thousands of men into Rome, and he sacks Rome. There is more than one way to get paid when you're under contract. He stays in contract with the Pope even after sacking Rome. This is the Condottieri. Now, not every Condottieri leads thousands of men like John Hawkwood. Some of them were a little lower. One of those was a Condottieri by the name of Galeazzo. Galeazzo led roughly around 800 to 1,000 men at any one time. He was an Italian Condottieri, and at one point, he was in France. And the Marshal of France was talking in the presence of Galeazzo about the cowardice of the Italian people. Galeazzo took offense to that. His honor was affronted. So he goes to the French nobility, and he pleads his case and says, your Marshal has affronted me and all of the Italians. I would like to duel him for our honor. And the French nobility said, no. So what did Galeazzo do? Galeazzo marches his way down to the Italian states. He winds up in Padua. He goes to the Paduan nobles and he says, this French Marshal has affronted me and all of Italian nobility. I would like to duel him for honor. And Padua says, yes. So these duels that they took place were spectacles. They brought in lots of people. There was weeks to prepare. So Galeazzo and Padua duels the Marshal of France. Their duel is supposed to be done on horseback in full armor to a joust. And what happens was, according to record, Galeazzo was taking a little bit longer than the French Marshal likes on him getting mounted. So instead, the French Marshal charges him. They fight not on horseback, in armor. The fight must have gotten messy because the nobility stepped in and said, okay, you are done. This has been satisfied. This is settled. And this kind of highlights the nature of these honored duels. The Paduan nobility clearly did not want the French Marshal to die under their watch. That was supposed to be a sportier duel where both are expected to walk away and get settled. This is the nature of the honor duels they were having. So obviously, Galeazzo totally was fine. Everyone was copacetic. Everyone walked away really happy because Galeazzo dueled the Marshal a second time. Now, in the second duel, they do go to the joust. They are in full armor. And Galeazzo just knocks the Marshal of France off of his horse. He strikes the Marshal in his visor with a lance. The Marshal's thrown off. Galeazzo won. Now, the Marshal of France, being so embarrassed by it, takes a vow to never wear a visor in war again, out of shame of what happened. And this kind of highlights how people viewed the Condottieri. Now, some of them would have been second, third-born noble sons, but it was insulting to the Marshal of France to lose to this lower Condottieri in this duel. Now, the irony of all that is Galeazzo, while under contract and sieging a city, is requested to negotiate a peace agreement with that city, in which case he goes up to the city to negotiate. As he lifts up his visor, the city shoots him with a crossbow, killing him instantly. This kind of highlights the nature of the Condottieri's world, where it's dangerous. They have to live to fight another day, and clearly killing someone under the banner of a peace negotiation highlights how people probably viewed the Condottieri in their own context. These were not the most well-loved people. Now, we do not know what Galeazzo's fights look like. We didn't see, they didn't document, they did this and then that and then a left and then a right. No, we don't have that. But what we do have is a manuscript by the fencing master that trained Galeazzo by the name of Fiore. Fiore was a fencing master in Italy. He wrote at least 4 manuscripts that we know of. And he talks about, in his biography, kind of presenting why you should learn from him, that he was one of the fencing masters who trained Galeazzo for his duel. Now, if you're name-dropping a famous duel at this time, you've got to be careful. So that's how we know he wasn't lying, because those are easily fact-checkable. We know he trained Galeazzo. So him name-dropping famous people he trained is a mark of distinction. Now, another thing Fiore says is he likes to teach in secret. He prefers to teach in courtyards with high walls so people can view his art. Because as you can imagine, if most of your income is coming from training people for duels, you do not want people being able to copy your work. It's no different than what we have today of intellectual property or trade secrets. Now, as you can imagine, if you're going around talking about how great of a swordsman you are and refusing to teach people, it gets the ire of certain individuals. According to Fiore, there were 5 different masters, 5 different fencing masters who asked them to be shown some of Fiore's art, to which case Fiore said no. They would say he didn't know what he was doing, which was an affront on his honor. Now, unlike Galeazzo's duels, which were sanctioned and with the nobility, Fiore just says he dueled 5 people in padded jacket with a sharp sword. He also said if he had the choice, he would rather fight 3 fights at the barrier than 1 fight with sharp swords. In the fight at the barrier, they'd be in full armor, and there'd be a little wall in between them so they could keep distance while still showing martial technique, but not getting close enough to hurt each other. What he was saying was he would rather do the sporting fight more often than a sharp fight. He didn't want to die. Now, he named Galeazzo. Galeazzo can openly talk about how he duels. Fiore does not. Fiore fights 5 duels in padded jacket and sharp sword, and says he won all 5 of them. We can probably take him for his word because he wrote the book after he had those 5 duels. Now, what likely took place was what the Italian legal structure called alla macchia, in the hidden, illegal duels. So what Fiore was doing when he said, I have fought these 5 people and have walked away unscathed, he was telling you he has fought 5 illegal duels, and he's not going to tell you who's dead, where they're buried, when they're buried, and how he did it. That's legally implicated. But he can tell you he fought those 5 duels. Now that's what we're going to showcase for you today. The alla macchia duel, with padded jacket, and sharp sword. But before we do that, we need to level set everyone on a little bit of technique so you can watch what we're doing and pick out the technique and learn from what we are doing. Now to start, this is a sword. Modern scholars, fantasy, they try to distinguish it. They try to categorize it. You get terms like longsword, you get terms like hand-and-a-half sword, bastard sword. This is just a sword. Long swording is a verb, and it is the use of the sword in 2 hands. I am fighting, I am longswording. Another term like this is called half-swording, where you hold the sword halfway down the blade so you can narrow the point and try to find gaps in armor to strike. You're shortening the blade to work it more like a dagger so the point's more nimble. You see that more in armored combat. So, this is a sword. I am now longswording, and as you can see, I can kind of use this sword in one hand. This sword's a little longer for that, as opposed to Daniel, who very comfortably can use his sword in one hand. And this highlights the fact that these are not Conan the Barbarian swords. Conan the Barbarian sword probably didn't exist. Why? Because swords have to move. How do you cut a steak? You don't chop it, you slice it. For a sword to be effective, it has to move, it has to make contact, it has to be quick, it has to cut, it has to slice, it has to thrust. This is why swordsmanship is not a game of strength, but a game of speed and technique and endurance and dexterity. For example, swords function as levers. As Daniel goes into long point here, the further away the point is from his hand, the more I can push it offline, because it's further away from his body. However, if he goes back in long point and I try to do the same closer, I can't do it. Because the closer the sword is to your arm, the more structure you have, and you can't muscle through it. Again, this is not a strength game, this is a dexterity game, this is a math game. We're measuring our angles. So according to Fiore, all swordsmanship starts with the art of wrestling. So his manuscripts start with wrestling, then it goes to wrestling versus dagger, dagger versus dagger, dagger versus sword, sword versus sword, sword versus spear, spear versus spear, sword versus horse. You get the idea. He builds to what we think of as knightly combat, but it all starts with wrestling. Now, why is that important? That highlights the fact that a lot of swordsmanship is footwork. So, in the manuscript, we have named positions. We have the guard of the lady. We have the window guard. We have iron gate. We have other iron gate. We have boar's tooth. Named positions we can start from. simple teaching technique that we do to today, right? We name these specific techniques. Now, if Daniel just throws a high cut at me, I can deflect it and strike. And according to Fiore, that's nothing more than a simple peasant strike. So we'll dissect that a little bit. I go up to cover to defend myself first. I use the momentum from here and strike here. Now the first action is driven with my right hand. The second action is actually driven by my left hand to control it. This is the advantage of longsword because I can use the sword and angle it and pivot. That's why the two-handed sword is such a nimble weapon. Now, with that, he says it's a peasant strike. That means even common fencers at this time, people who aren't learning from manuscripts, understand the concept of deflecting and changing which side they are striking with. Now, we mentioned footwork, we mentioned distance. Alternatively, Daniel could throw that same cut and I could shift all my weight back, letting that sword pass, moving forward and striking. I can use my own distance and footwork to control it. I don't have to just use the sword to defend me. There's a lot of footwork in combat. So now what we are going to do, now that you understand the basics of swordsmanship, we're going to do a very modern concept called putting on safety equipment. So we do not script these shows. We do not know how they are going to go. As we mentioned, we do historical European martial arts, and we have our own safety gear and everything else. There's a little bit behind the magic, behind these awesome costumes you're wearing. These jackets are designed for puncture resistance, so if these blades happen to break, the jacket can protect us from the remaining blade. We have hard plastic under the costume to keep us safe. Our bony bits, as you can probably use a little bit of imagination, there's a lot of hard plastic under the costume to keep really important parts safe. And this is just like what they did in their time. They thought, how do we train safely? Because I can't train swordsmanship if I keep breaking my training partners. So it's the same concept we do today. So like you said, we're going to showcase what a duel might look like in padded jacket, sharp sword, a la Mafia. And with that, I'm now going to get ready and hand you over if you guys have any questions to ask Daniel.
So, any questions at all from what you saw? Questions on swords, questions on the history, or anything? All right, I guess Johnny did a great job. So, what we are going to do, like Donnie said, we are going to fight. We're going to see who comes out alive in a fight of padded jackets and sharp swords. Now, one thing to notice, since we have just padded jackets and swords, we are wearing this extra protection. This is not what they would have worn. Later on with armor, they might have been wearing metal gauntlets. We are not. A strike to a hand, a strike to our forearm, anywhere that disables us is as good as losing the duel.
So we will be asking you to use a little bit of imagination if our hands get hit, that our hand got hit. Now, as we mentioned, as a Condottieri, I need to live to fight another day. Which means, if I happen to strike Daniel's leg while he strikes my head, well, I'm probably dead, and Daniel's probably going to die in an infirmary later. We have a lot of duels that are documented where somebody won the duel and died the next day from injury. For sword techniques to be perfect, we have to be able to hit safely. We have to be able to hit our opponent without getting hit. That is why it's the art of self-defense and not the art of running in and getting stabbed by your opponent. So with all that, I have some very bad news for all of you. Daniel in private told me that he does not like people who visit Uhuburg Castle. He thinks they come with a certain stench to them that he just doesn't like. Now, me, being represented by the Merchant Guild, took offense to that. And I took offense to that not because I like you guys spending money in Uhuburg, but because I care about each and every one of you and your honor. I promise. So I took offense to that, and I challenged Daniel here to a duel. Now, unfortunately, we don't have 6 weeks, and we can't find any nobles, so we're just going to have to settle this a la Mafia. And worth pointing out that in Italian legal manuals at the time, they talked about only the young and brash fought in padded jacket and arming sword, because if you are fighting in this level of gear, a la Mafia, you probably are not expecting for a noble to break up your fight. You are probably expecting for it to be life and death. That is the type of fight we will be simulating for you guys today. So with that, Daniel, are you ready?
We'll see.
Let's do it.
Yep.
Daniel, how'd you get yourself hit?
So I attempted to strike Donnie. Donnie stepped offline out of the way of my strike and was able to strike into my shoulder and then retreat out of the way of my follow-up strike. Just because he struck me does not mean the fight's over. I'm in motion and he still has to avoid me trying to get him for getting me.
That's right. It's not enough for me just to hit him. I have to defend myself and walk away cleanly. So as you can imagine, a nice cut on his dominant hand, on some of those nice muscles and tendons that he needs to control the sword, probably going to end the fight. And that highlights one of the things about lost section or unhonorable combat, where the whole body can start to get targeted. Hold on.
Great. Do it. What happened, Donnie?
Same idea. As we were dancing around, my hand extended a little more forward, and Daniel got the tip of my thumb. I really liked my thumb. That's probably going to end the fight.
You can't have it back. No refunds.
No refunds. Now, something you're probably noticing is we're being kind of cagey about this fight. We're taking our time. We're not just running in and striking each other. We're measuring each other. We're making little tweaks before we get into an engagement to fight. Again, because we do not want to get hit by the sword. So we're being patient. We're being deliberate about our actions.
I accidentally grabbed like a tiny
Yeah.
No, I don't know.
Yep, that did it. Well done, sir.
Thank you. Now, one thing you probably heard was us communicating with Joe. So I struck his mask, but because we're trying to pretend as if we don't have this gear, I felt like I hit the bubble that his mask makes as opposed to where he was. So we continue moving on. You saw us get into that fight. You saw us get into that rhythm. You saw two things. One, you saw me again striking along his head, but not relying on that because maybe that wasn't good enough. So again, defending his response, and then as he brought his arms again, striking the torso. Because I can't rely on that first action. I've got to keep myself safe. I've got to respond. I couldn't guarantee that second head hit worked because the first one did not. So continuing to move forward, continuing to think about the fight until it's over. There you go.
What happened, Donnie?
Again, Daniel reading distance. He saw me change my guard. He got me thinking midway, and he lunged forward to strike my arm before I can get into the engagement. Well done. There you go. So Daniel, how did you land that hit?
So, I saw Donnie in a position where he was a little too close for me. However, his sword was in a really good position to stop a cut. I didn't want to give him the advantage and let him control my sword. So I adopted that half sword position we talked about, which allowed me to close the distance to stop the strike at my head, rotate in, and deliver a thrust. And now, there is nothing he can do to stop this strike from happening. I am completely safe. And so, if I can get close enough to perform a technique like that, that's what I want to do. Because what do I want to do? I want to walk away from this duel and not die of infirmary. That's a great way to do it.
And again, this highlights the fact that that technique would not have been effective without the ability to have an extra crossguard. Swords have different matters of protecting their hand, so this extra crossguard is what allowed him to do that action. Good job.
After the show, we're going to we're going to take out the meat. He needs nap too. But he needs to. Hold on, buddy. He needs to. He needs to hit cheeks.
Yes, nicely done.
Daniel, how'd you get hit that time?
Well, I thought he was going to fall for the same trick twice. So on the first engagement, he had his sword low. So I attempted to bring my sword and get on top of the sword. Didn't work the first time, but I was able to parry his follow-up strike. So I thought, I'll push my luck and try it again. Donnie learned though, and I went, and I could not get back in time. Well done, Donnie.
Not committing to the first strike, but setting up the second strike. That's actually one of the first plays we see with Fiore, where you threaten one side, as they push, you strike to the other side.
All around, we're not both those.
Well done, that was clean.
Thank you.
Oh, what are we, Donnie?
Two
Well, that
dead
makes us two dead
idiots.
As Daniel went in for the thrust, he did not cover the line where my attack would have come from. My thrust landed on him as well, and we both ran each other through. As we mentioned, these shows are not scripted, and we try very hard not for that to happen, but alas, it happens nonetheless.
Whoopsie.
Whoopsie indeed.
Ow. I am no more. I am deceased.
Now, worth pointing out, you probably did hear a little bit of scrape on my own mask. Again, it's that bubble effect. Dana, do you feel like that strike landed with any force?
Absolutely not. It was flat anyways.
It was flat. Another thing we try to point out is, because we're trying to teach the technique, we're not playing tag here. These swords have edges. If we hit flat, that doesn't cut. That doesn't do anything. We have to be aware of that. So, as we're training, we can feel what happens when a strike is flat because the blade bends more as opposed to with the edge. It's something we're paying attention to. Ultimately, I got a little lucky. Couple more?
Let's do a couple more.
All right.
Doing good. Well done. That was a great flurry.
Daniel had that happen.
So Donnie started advancing on me. I was fighting on my back feet, which means I lose that ability to manage my footwork that we talked about. I'm getting my feet closer and closer together. I have less and less room to work. I have to be tighter. Donnie works my blade high on the defense, and then switch to low. And, well, that's it for me.
As I'm bringing that fight higher and higher, I'm opening them up. And as I squat my legs, because I don't want to lean over, that'll break my flexors. But I can squat, change the angle of attack, and then when his touch comes back down, I still have the same defense. Creating openings by mixing up high and low attacks.
And you'll notice one thing there. Donnie is not over-committing to striking my legs. If he just dived down, leaned with his head, and struck my legs, and even if you got back, you're likely going to lose your head. What Donnie emphasized there was the squatting of his form down. Not leaning, but squatting to drop his shoulders to get that strike.
That's right.
Much more effective.
Now also worth noting, that cut went across his center line and into the leg. There's a lot of really nice arteries that don't like to be nicked in that area. One more for all good measure.
Let's do one more, Donnie.
All right. There you go. Now you got the touch. All right. Daniel, what happened?
Woo! Well, there's a lot of dancing there, a lot of trying different techniques to see what we can make work. But every time I felt like I was getting in a position I wanted, Donnie said, no, you don't. I don't want to die today. And changed his position so that if I attacked, I would not have a good time. Until finally, he had to tell. When I feinted, which was intending to strike but not doing it, I saw him raise his arms high. And I thought, I can do something with that. So I feinted another strike into the house sword to protect my head. However, Donnie backed off when we got into a bit of a scrap. We talked about at the start. Fiore believed that one of the core fundamentals of sword fighting was wrestling. And you saw it there. When we are that close, unless you can get your sword laying against someone's body and slice, it's going to go to the ground, and it's going to be messy. And I'm glad he did, because he's a better wrestler than I am.
And ultimately, he bought the blade in play. As I was trying to push it away, he was able to press it against me and drag it. That's where the slicer would come. So his blade was in contact with me, on my neck, down to my hip, pressing and slicing on.
Woo!
Now,
really tired.
the disclaimer. This is one time in history, in one region in history, with one specific weapon, with one context this weapon could be used. As you can imagine, if we had extra hand protection, those hand shots wouldn't have worked anymore. If we had extra armor, those open cuts wouldn't have worked anymore. Those head hits, if you had a helmet, wouldn't work anymore. The fight starts to change as you had armor. If I had multiple opponents I had to deal with, I wouldn't stop and measure all this time against this opponent, because I have another one I have to worry about. So the fight speeds up, things change. This was trying to simulate a very specific type of fight of the fight with sharp swords, padded jackets, and an all-in-mock duel. Now, what we have down here is what we call our petty. And it's a collection of our training swords, which feel like real swords and are safe to use. We also have some of these manuscripts we've been talking about, an example of these historical ones, with different weapons, different armor. So please, come on down, ask questions, we can talk all about it. And with that, I'm Donnie.
And I'm Daniel.
And this was the Appalachian Sword Show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you want to stick around,